Okay, can you hear me? You can hear me. Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. I am hopeful, especially for the final portion, that you will do most of the talking. So I'll spend the rest of the time warming you up for that. I'm going to talk, as it says on the slide, about different ways of thinking about AI regulation, and in particular, how we might put that into a larger context, including not just national, but transnational context, and why that might matter. So, as was mentioned by Jess during her introduction, I'm a teaching professor here with a joint appointment in philosophy and computer science at Northeastern. This is the start of my fifth year. Typically, the courses that I teach here focus on the ethical and socio-political dimensions of emerging technologies, but really what that mostly means is digital technologies, and in particular, over the last couple of years, the broad suite of things that we might call AI. I also work with colleagues in the computer science department to help develop collaborate ethics modules for some of their courses, so ways of embedding the teaching of ethical concepts alongside the teaching of foundational programming concepts. And this summer, as well as last summer, I was a grantee on a grant from the Mozilla Foundation to help spread the teaching of responsible computing science programs to other universities that were interested. I do some advising and consulting work with government and private industry as well. And as just mentioned, currently my research is on artificial agents and parasocial relationships. I didn't remember that there was going to be a survey at the outset. That's a helpful thing. But coming into this, as I was preparing for today, I tried to make minimal assumptions about things that you all already know. I recognize when there's hundreds of people in attendance, it's hard to know what the average level of understanding of any of these things is. It's hard for me to know my own level of understanding given how much is changing from day to day. So I'm going to try to avoid too much technical jargon. And if there be any things that I say that are unclear or that you would like me to clarify further, please let me know during the question and answer portion. So I'm going to set a little bit of context. I will talk a little bit about some of the key actors in AI regulation. I will compare a couple of regulatory approaches. These will be at the national level. So there will be Brazil, China, the United States, and the European Union. And then again, this is the final part where I hope most of you will be doing most of the talking, exploring some of the implications for what any of these regulatory schemes might mean for your work as public sector employees and for the services that you provide. So let's start by setting the context. A couple of different things come to mind when people talk about AI regulation, and that actually makes it very hard to talk about AI regulation because we have an issue of people perhaps talking past each other or not even talking about the same things. So I want to explain and illustrate some of the ways in which it can be confusing to know what it is we're talking about when we're talking about AI in the context of regulation. On this slide, you can see different ways of trying to distinguish AI as the larger category from things like machine learning models or deep learning models as subcategories. You can also see that even within the subcategory of machine learning and or deep learning, we have models that are used or systems that are used to make predictions, and we have systems that are used to generate new content, such as somebody's voice, an image, an essay, a report, or what have you. So one way of thinking about the target of AI regulation is in terms of all of the things that fit into those subsets on the left-hand image, right? Machine learning related systems, deep learning related systems. There is, however, another way of thinking about AI, and that's not as just a sort of abstraction at the level of software, but to look at the larger infrastructure, which includes hardware and which includes social and environmental contexts. So on these slides, or sorry, this slide, you'll see images that try to pull the camera back and give more of a glimpse into what it is that makes the software itself possible. So the data collection, the actual hardware on which the systems live, how people are compensated for the work that they do in, let's say, cleaning the data or the work that they did that created the data that was used in the first place, how the models are distributed, and so forth. So this is all by way of saying that there are different targets of AI regulation because different people are talking about different things. As for regulation itself, that word sometimes conjures up the notion of people who are passing laws. And to be fair, I will say that many of the examples that I'm going to give later on are examples in which laws are the primary drivers of regulation. But as we know from our own lives and from other contexts, there are other ways in which you can regulate someone's behavior, either at the individual level or at the collective level. The legal theorist Lawrence Lessig wrote a book a good quarter of a century ago now, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, in which he argues and illustrates ways in which laws are not the only ways in which we regulate things. So he was particularly interested in code, by which he meant software and software infrastructure, as itself being a regulatory mechanism. The image on the slide, the thing that would best fit code is architecture. So he talked about in particular the way that the architecture of the internet made certain things easier to do, made other things harder to do, made some things possible and other things impossible. And that's by just the architectural design of the internet itself, even setting aside market mechanisms or laws that might have been passed or different kinds of social or political norms. So when we talk about regulation, again, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that there are lots of ways in which we could regulate things, including AI systems. In addition to using the law interacts with economics, it interacts with various social norms that we might have, and it interacts with the design constraints or design features of these systems. I'm obligated to talk about reasons that some people might be cautious about regulating AI. These are also reasons that some people are generally skeptical about regulation, period. So I don't want to claim that these are uniquely, that they come up uniquely in the context of AI systems. So there's one called the Collingwood dilemma, and its sort of corollary, the pacing problem. Another grounds for caution is, again, going back to the earlier discussion, it's unclear exactly what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about regulating AI. What is the thing, or what are the things that we're talking about regulating? There's also often a distrust of the would-be regulators. It could be that you think they've been captured by the very industries that they're meant to regulate. It could mean that you think that they don't have good intentions. It could mean that you think they don't know what they're doing. It could be some combination of those things. And then finally, there are also economic and geopolitical considerations that some people fear would take a back seat if we focus too much on regulation, or that would in fact actually harm or undermine various kinds of economic or geopolitical goals that the nation or the political unit might have. So let me talk briefly about all of those things. Let's start with the Collingwood dilemma. This is named after an author who wrote a book in 1980 in which he was examining the development of different kinds of technologies and doing a sort of combination of history and social commentary. And what he claimed is that you face an issue when you're thinking about any sort of new technology, which is that when it begins, it's very hard to know what its potential impacts or effects are going to be. But that's also the time at which it would be easier to, or easiest even, to control that system or those systems. But as they become more embedded in a society, as people take them more and more for granted, as they become parts of the infrastructure of a society, for example, it becomes more and more difficult to actually turn around or reverse course at that point. So imagine, for example, the difference between trying to regulate automobiles in the 1910s versus doing so in the 2010s. So at this point, we have a lot of evidence about the effect of automobiles on culture, on environment, and so forth. But it would be very, very difficult to sort of unwind all of those effects. So he's making a similar claim at a general level about most technologies. And so one reason that some people are skeptical about regulation is this idea that by the time you know the regulations are necessary, it might be too late in some ways. And if you impose regulations too prematurely, then you might prevent some of the real benefits that the technologies could bring with them. That's also illustrated by Adam Tierer and the image from one of his blog posts on the right-hand side of the screen, that the pace of technology, many people believe this, that the pace of technology outstrips the pace of our politics. That is to say, both in terms of the general public's understanding of these technologies, people's awareness of their effects, let alone politicians' awareness of the technologies and understanding of them and their ability to sort of catch up to where the technologies are taking us. A second reason that some people are skeptical about regulation is again the lack of clarity about what it is exactly that we're meant to be focusing on. So in this diagram, compute means computational resources. So how many computer chips do you actually have? How many data centers do you have? What's the infrastructure more broadly speaking? Where does the data come from to train AI models, for example? What are the models themselves? What are the features that they have? And then how are they actually deployed in the world? So that's the agent at the top there of the Lego pyramid. And any one of those or all of them in combination could be the subject of regulation. So it's again very important to know when we're talking about regulating AI, does that include regulating where data centers can be built, or does it just focus on not building AI agents that cause people to fall in love with them, right? So any one of those, the answer could be yes to both, but it's sometimes unclear what it's meant to be. A third reason for skepticism about regulation, of course, is distrusting the people who would be doing the regulation. So in this case, again, I'm focusing mostly on people who would be able to pass laws, not necessarily to enact other forms of regulation. So on the left-hand side, we have the Democratic senator from Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, who asked at testimony a few years back, he wanted someone from Meta to promise to prevent Finsta. Now, Finsta, as you all know, is slang for a fake Instagram account. And so the question that he was asking really was incoherent. So it gave rise to the idea that, okay, here are these people who are supposedly in charge of these new and important technologies, but who seem maybe not aware of how at a fundamental level they actually work or even what words mean. And we see a similar thing with our current Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. Some of you may have seen the video clip from a few months ago in which she pronounced AI as A1. She did this repeatedly in a talk that she was giving and didn't seem to be aware that that's not how you pronounce it. And so again, we can laugh at that, but we might also worry, well, do we really want this particular technology and do we really want its potential effects and benefits to be shaped by people who maybe don't seem to have a grasp on it? And then finally, of course, there are the economic and geopolitical considerations. So in the United States context, and I know that not all of you visiting today are from the United States, but in the United States, one of the cards that's played very frequently in many discussions of AI regulation is "but China." And that's a shorthanded way of saying um, from the speaker's point of view, it's important that the United States have global dominance over this technology and its direction, and that anything that might impede that, such as what are conceived of as overly burdensome regulations, might lead the US to ceding its dominance to some other state or some other group of entities. Okay, so that's all well and good, but some people say, well, we still need some kinds of regulation. So the next couple of slides are just presenting a few different reasons for which that's the case. You might think that the radical reconfiguration of relationships between the state and the individual that these kinds of technologies make possible calls for some kind of checks on the power of the state to use those technologies in ways that, again, might not be to the benefit of all of its citizens or all of its members. There's also at the level of ownership and property, perhaps some unclarity right now that's being worked out in US courts and in other courts around the world about the provenance of the data that was used to train a lot of the AI systems that many of us use, whether we're talking about large language models or other kinds of AI systems. So are we giving permission to that just because our data is on the web? Is that the same thing as giving permission for it to become training data for someone's model? Is it okay that people not be compensated or not be acknowledged, or is there some sort of scheme that needs to be created for that? A very common topic of discussion, especially in the context of predictive systems, is discrimination of various kinds in the fields of healthcare, for example, in the fields of college admissions, but also in the field of hiring, or that's not a field, but the general activity of applying for jobs and being hired for jobs. Increasingly, of course, as deepfakes become more sophisticated, as the realism of images, voices, and videos becomes harder and harder to separate from their actual sources, it becomes more and more difficult to say, well, this thing that you are presenting to me as information is actually fabricated. So here's an example from the current conflict between Israel and Iran of a deep faked image. I want to have one more example, and this slide is just a content warning about the next slide. So it refers to various kinds of abuse and to self-harm. Another reason for regulation has to do with the toll that it takes, especially when we're thinking about complex AI systems involving generative technologies. Someone still has to train them. Someone still has to read a lot of things and see a lot of things that are quite vile in order to help train the models to be able to not produce or generate those things themselves. So the conditions that those workers face are also ones that we might think call for some sort of oversight. Another thing that people are increasingly saying calls for oversight is the environmental costs of data centers and the related sorts of infrastructural effects that they have. In particular, because a lot of these uh, vendors are not very forthcoming about how much energy, how much water, how much other resources, many of which are non-renewable, they are using for these models. Um, I'm going to skip that slide. I'll come back to it later. Let's talk about some key actors in AI regulation. This will be the shortest part. So what this slide shows is, I've tried to put in three different categories, some of what I think are the key actors. So the group on the left represents nation states and regional collections of nations, such as the G7, the African Union, the European Union. The column in the middle is my best attempt to look at nonprofit organizations that I think are actually having effects when it comes to shaping discussions about different kinds of AI regulation. There are lots and lots of non-governmental organizations and nonprofit organizations that are very interested, very concerned, and indeed very excited about a lot of the possibilities when it comes to AI. But in terms of the ones that actually are having their voices heard, it's quite a small number, particularly in the United States context. And then on the right-hand side are some, again, of the major actors who are shaping thoughts and discussions and indeed having a great deal of influence over those discussions about what it would mean to regulate AI, which parts of AI systems need regulation and why, and who indeed should be in charge of them. So let's now compare a couple of regulatory approaches. And here again, as I said earlier, I'm going to be focusing primarily on state actors, so not on some of the people or organizations that were listed on the previous slide, like non-governmental organizations or corporations. So the four examples will be from the United States, starting with the issuance of former President Biden's executive order, which then was rescinded with the start of the Trump administration this January. Then I'll talk briefly about Brazil, the European Union, and the People's Republic of China. And I'm going to frame it in terms of these questions. So you want to regulate AI. So first of all, what is the thing you want to regulate? What's the basis or what are the bases on which you want to regulate it? So in other words, why? Why does it matter to so much that it needs to be regulated? Is your focus primarily preventing harms, or is it reacting to harms that may have occurred after the fact? And then also, what are the methods? Who are the agents who are going to be engaging in the regulation, right? So in other words, how will you actually do that? So let's start with Biden's executive order 14110. Again, this is deprecated, obsolete, not in effect. Um, but I want to just walk you through a couple of the answers to the questions on the previous slide to show what they were aiming for. I'm going to start on the right-hand side, actually. It's important to recognize this was an executive order. This was never anything that was passed as a law or implemented as a law. So Congress never had an opportunity to debate this. Representatives never took this back to their constituents and so forth. This was an executive order that was meant to operate. And primarily the way executive orders are supposed to work is that they are directives to federal agencies and how they should do things and how they should interpret certain things. So in this case, the executive order was aimed at federal agencies. Again, because it's an executive order, it wasn't aimed at corporations or at individuals. The stated priorities, and these are indeed outlined in the very first couple of paragraphs of the executive order, basically in order that they're listed here on the slide. The national security of the United States against foreign adversaries or competitors, economic competitiveness, again, against foreign competition, domestic infrastructure. Now, this was an interesting one because this was about the need to make sure that the United States had a sufficient power grid, electrical grid, other kinds of infrastructure, including roads and supply chain considerations, to make the growth of AI systems possible in the first place, and to make sure that those would not be reasons for any sort of lagging behind. And all of those were then done towards an aim or towards a view of asserting and maintaining the United States' global leadership in AI. Leadership in this sense, I think, was defined primarily in terms of technical considerations, that is to say, being on the technological cutting edge, but then also making sure that these systems were being used in ways that advanced the United States' interests. The primary way that AI is described in that document is not in terms of precise definitions, but in terms of distinctions. So AI infrastructure, which again goes to the question of the hardware on which these machines were built and on which they are trained and run, is distinguished from the models themselves, which in turn were distinguished from foundation models. This is a concept that refers to gigantic models. So ones such as those produced by OpenAI or Anthropic or Meta or Google are called foundational. And what that is supposed to do is to be a term of art that means these are general purpose models that could be the foundation for more specific contexts of use, but that in and of themselves are not meant for any specific purpose. Let's go to Brazil now. So this is a bill that has been passed by the lower house of their Congress, but has not yet been passed by the upper house and has not yet been signed by the president of Brazil. So here, the aim of the bill is general purpose AI, and it distinguishes that from generative AI. So I misspoke. It's actually aimed at both of those things, but the law takes care to distinguish them and tries to define generative AI in ways that I think many of us are already familiar with. That is to say, systems that are able to generate new content, whether it be images, voice, or text, or anything else, on the basis of how it was trained. The stated priorities of the law include the protection of human rights. A subcategory of that is intellectual property rights. So clarifying, for example, if something that you wrote, maybe you're an author, or maybe you're an artist, was used as training data, how might that require some sort of acknowledgement or compensation on the part of the person who made the model? This is primarily a proactive focused or proactively focused set of laws. That is to say, it's meant to prevent models that are deemed to be excessively risky or systems that might include those models from being deployed in the first place or even from being created in the first place. But then secondarily, perhaps after the fact, maybe you know ahead of time that something was excessively risky. So this law would in some sense try to prevent that model from being made. But maybe you don't know that it's excessively risky until it actually gets used. Perhaps it's used in ways that weren't anticipated. And so in that case, the law tries to clarify some of the liability and penalties for harms that the systems might cause. The ways in which it engages in this regulation include audits. So audits might include audits by third parties. And what they would do is to, for example, look at the model, perhaps look at the data, look at the system or the context in which the model is used, try to either identify or anticipate potential benefits and potential harms that the model might have. Usually when we talk about auditing, for example, in the context of accounting, we're talking about already well-established sets of standards against which things are then measured or tested. And so part of what this law would do would be to help set out guidelines for auditing these systems, right? So if we think that, okay, here's a system that's meant to help with credit scoring, what's an acceptable level of false positives and false negatives, right? So that might be the kind of thing that auditors would help to determine. The main targets of the law, if that be the right word, is our private industry. So this is not primarily constraining what the government of Brazil can do, nor is it constraining what individuals can do. And its main mechanism is legal penalties. So that mostly means fines, but I think it can include also some jail time. The European Union is a conglomeration of states, but they also work together through this entity, the European Union. Their AI Act adopted um, really early in the days of generative AI. Well, that is to say, it first was drafted then and then adopted last year. So if you go and read it, excuse me, you will still see some parts that seem to be a little bit dated. But the main focus of this is general purpose AI systems and models. So again, not ones that are specifically used in a healthcare context or in a financial context or in a different context, right? So general purpose models. The priorities that they set out in the AI Act include the ones on the slide. So first of all, global cooperation, both in the development and the use of AI systems, and the protection of health and other fundamental rights. Excuse me. And what they do to try to make a focus on the protection of those fundamental rights is to say that the aim of this act is really um, to provide a lot of scrutiny to what they call high risk systems. So one of the things that the act does is to try to classify different kinds of AI systems and models in terms of their level of risk. So low and medium risk get much less scrutiny under this law than high risk ones do. So what are the ways in which this kind of scrutiny shows up? The Act creates a new set of laws and agencies. It's also important to point out there are some existing laws and agencies that are already in place relating to similar things. So many of you may be familiar with the GDPR that the EU passed a few years back, governing the collection and use of data and how that interacts with user privacy. So many of the things that are in the AI Act, um, different policy wonks actually are not in agreement about this. Some believe that some of what's in the GDPR actually is undermined perhaps by what's in the AI Act, and there are others who say no, they fit well together. We can get into that later, but the point I wanted to make is simply that in addition to the new set of laws and agencies, this act is also riding piggyback on some of the existing ones. The notion of a regulatory sandbox is an interesting one to me. This is the idea, and it's not unique to the European Union. This is a thing that has been tried in other places as well. But the notion of a regulatory sandbox is in effect, a sort of playground where, let's say you have developed a model as part of your company, right? So you have a model. For a little bit of time, what you can do in the sandbox is have a little bit less scrutiny, and indeed have fewer penalties that you might be subject to. And the purpose of creating regulatory sandboxes is to almost give a dry run or sort of a rough draft of what a fuller bodied set of regulations might need to anticipate and deal with. And so the idea is that if you provide a sandbox, then you make it easier for people to be more willing to subject their products to regulation in the first place, because that's a sort of testing ground. And again, you want to make people feel safe that if some problem arises or if there's some way in which their model turns out to be high risk and then subject to this sort of scrutiny, that they feel as though the regulators are working with them and not simply lowering the boom on them. The AI Act, as it says here, is aimed primarily at private industry, but also at government and federal agencies, not at individuals. And then finally, the People's Republic of China adopted interim general AI measures in 2023. One of the things about talking about AI regulation, especially in an international context, is that there are entire websites that have trackers, and all that they do is update every day the introduction of different bills, the passage of various bills in different nations and different national groups across the planet. So that's relevant here to the discussion of China because what I have on the slide here is what was adopted 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago now. But there are many, many other bills that are under consideration and under deliberation right now. So come back in a month or 2 months, and perhaps some of what's on this slide will be obsolete. Okay, so the focus of this set of measures is on three different things. Generative models, generative AI models. And again, that's defined pretty much in the same way that the other entities have defined it in terms of models that are able to generate new content of a variety of kinds on the basis of the data on which they were provided. Service providers. So service providers are defined in the law as those entities, mostly companies, that create the AI models in the first place. And here, the focus is really on large scale models, perhaps what would be called in other contexts, foundational models. And then service users. So the AI service users could be smaller companies. They could also be individuals who are using their models, using DeepSeek, for example, or any of the ones that are available there as well as DeepSeek. So the priorities for China, the Chinese leadership, you'll notice resonances between the ones that the USA lists and the ones that are listed here. So national security, economic competitiveness. Um, there is also an interesting addition, labeling AI generated content. So this may become a feature that other governing bodies want to pick up on, and I know that many are interested in this. So in the United States, for example, the Take It Down Act was recently passed by Congress, in part to deal with this threat of deepfaked videos and images. So that's also something that's built into their law, that anything that is AI generated must be labeled as such. And then another feature goes to the infrastructural issue, and that's a requirement for greater standardization of the design requirements. So the design requirements for what? Well, both the design requirements for software systems, but also design requirements for infrastructure at a physical level. So that means the ways that things are being done in different provinces in China needs to be harmonized, and that's an important priority for them. The regulatory methods. So one of them requires that models be pre-registered. So what pre-registration means is that if you are building a model that you intend for public use, and especially for large-scale public use, you need to register it with the government agency. What you are doing in that case is more or less attesting that this is something that is not going to cause large harm. It's not going to violate fundamental rights, and it's not going to be socially destructive. This law, like the other ones that I canvassed a minute ago, establishes some new laws and agencies to help regulate different components of AI, but also, or different uses of AI, but also builds on pre-existing laws and agencies. And like many of the others, its primary focus is industry. So that's corporations, companies, not so much government agencies, and not so much individuals. Okay, so yes, this is the part now where I'm going to learn from you. I need to learn from you as we think about what some of the implications might be for public sector workers, people who are providing public services, in different contexts, whether we're talking about the United States or other nations or other bodies altogether. So the way that I want to set up this part of the conversation is just reminding you that when we're talking about AI regulation, AI itself is still contested, and that leads to the outcome that AI regulation is going to be contested. This slide, the image on the bottom of the slide, is to a research paper from the AI Now Institute. It's building on the idea that you'll hear in some corners, at least in the United States, that we have other regulatory bodies that regulate things that are not AI. And it would be helpful if we didn't pretend that we have to start from scratch when it comes to thinking about AI regulation. We can learn, for example, from the Food and Drug Administration, that's what the FDA stands for, and we can look at the ways in which our food products and all of the things that are parts of our food supply are regulated. We can also look at the ways in which medicine, pharmaceuticals, drugs themselves are regulated. So in the case of drug regulation, for example, the way that it works in the United States is that if you want your drug to be sold and it's a prescription drug, that means the people who are the choke points are physicians. And so we have a regulatory scheme in this country for drug approval that sets a high bar for when a drug can go from being just an idea in someone's head to being something that is marketed to physicians. And one of the things that is true about a lot of drug trials is that, well, that there are drug trials in the first place, right? So we have a control group, we have an experimental group. We sort of see what some of the side effects are of the drugs. And there's an entire well set up process for drugs to go through to get FDA approval before they are just put out there for the public to use. Um, we don't and haven't so far had anything like that when it comes to AI systems, right? They've just sort of been put out there for all of us, and it's been a societal-wide experiment. Um, and so one of the things that some people have suggested is, well, maybe it's time to tighten the reins a little bit. Maybe we should be thinking about other federal agencies, other government agencies, and the ways that they think about regulation and the things that should be regulated and how that should happen. And it may not be too late, according to some of these people, to apply some of those lessons. So I'm interested, particularly those of you who are public sector workers in different agencies, to hear some of your thoughts about what you see as some of the strengths or limitations of the kinds of regulatory systems that are in place where you work, either as things that we could adopt lessons from and perhaps adapt them as we're thinking about AI regulation, or even as cautionary tales where you think that we should learn a lesson about what not to do. So general implications, and I will end my remarks here. Um, we know that the idea that there should be little or minimal regulation has not served us well in most other areas where there have been technologies of any kind, let alone ones that are said to be as revolutionary and transformative as AI technologies are said to be. We also know that AI systems um, again, because of the societies in which they come and the existing geopolitical relations and existing economic orders, can magnify existing harms. We also know that they can cause different harms that perhaps weren't possible to cause before. We also want it to be the case, or sorry, we want to acknowledge that um, because of those harms, we want to make sure that people acknowledge those harms and are seeking to mitigate them. Because if they don't, if they neither acknowledge them or if they downplay them or don't provide some form of redress, there might be a very strong backlash, perhaps in some sectors of society, perhaps in society more broadly, that could get in the way of actual potential beneficial uses of AI systems. And I want to make it clear, maybe despite the sort of through line of my remarks today, that I think there are lots of potentially beneficial uses of AI systems. And so I think it should be all the more imperative that we have methods in place and systems in place for helping to distinguish the better ones from the worse ones. Finally, I think that there's a false dilemma that's often presented in this kind of discussion where we can either have, quote, innovation or we can have regulation. And those things are said to be diametrically opposed. I think, as I said, that that's a false dilemma. I think that regulation itself can be a way for people to be innovative. Um, Again, this is because laws are not the only forms of regulation. Laws by themselves are not the only forms of regulation. But I think laws can also be a way, in concert with things like norms and infrastructure and markets and other economic systems, they can be ways for us to express certain values that are important to us and to defend and maintain those values. So I think it's important as we reflect on the role of regulation in AI, um, not to think that regulation can prevent innovation, but rather it could itself be an expression of innovation. All right, thank you, everyone. I will. So the floor is open now for questions. Also, as I said a moment ago, I would really